The Ever Given was stuck for 6 days in the Suez Canal and was costing around 400 million US dollars an hour for that whole time. If this blockade would have been extended, it would have been destructive for the world economy. Very destructive. Like what happened in 1956 when the canal was closed for 6 months, and in 1967 for 8 whole years. In 1956, an international conflict erupted over the Suez Canal. The incident became known as the Suez Crisis. This crisis put the world on edge, rattling diplomatic relationships, and even brought up a threat of nuclear war. Before we talk about the Suez Crisis and what happened after it, we have to look at the history of the Suez Canal itself. The modern Suez Canal opened in 1869. The canal created an artificial waterway between the Red Sea and the Mediterranean Sea, making trade more convenient between Europe and East Asia. The Suez Canal was of great importance to the British because it connected much of their empire. So when Egypt achieved independence in 1922, the British took measures to ensure their control over the canal. In 1936, the Anglo-Egyptian Treaty was signed by Britain and Egypt, allowing British troops to remain in the canal zone until 1956. But things were changing in Egypt. With the help of military officers, the Egyptians deposed their monarchy, and this guy, Jamal Abdel Nasser, became the country's new president. By 1954, Nasser started to pressure the British to end their military presence in the Suez Canal. Also, during the Cold War, Nasser's anti-imperialist agenda gained him the approval of the Soviet Union's communist government and their leader Nikita Khrushchev. In July of 1956, with financial and armed support from the Soviets, Nasser ordered Egyptian forces to seize the Suez Canal from the British and nationalize it, which means he wanted to make the canal Egypt's public property. He believed the tolls Egypt would collect from the ships passing through would help in the country's development. For the next few months, Britain, France, Israel, and the United States scrambled to figure out how to handle Egypt's takeover of the Suez. On October 29, 1956, Israel attacked Egypt. Israel wanted to resolve the Suez Crisis as well as reopen the Strait of Tiran, an important trade route that Egypt had previously closed. 2 days later, British and French forces also attacked Egypt and took control of the area around the Suez Canal. The situation quickly escalated. By 5th November 1956, Khrushchev threatened to nuke Western Europe if Britain, Israel, and France did not withdraw from Egypt. United States President Eisenhower warned Khrushchev not to get directly involved. At the same time, Eisenhower was furious that Britain, France, and Israel had kept the US in the dark about this plan. He threatened 3 countries with economic sanctions if they did not withdraw from Egypt. Britain and France withdrew by December. Finally, Israel bowed down to US pressure in March of 1957, bringing the Suez Canal crisis to an end. Though the Suez Crisis lasted less than a year, its effects were profound and long-lasting. Immediately, a United Nations peacekeeping force was sent in to supervise the ceasefire and to restore order. The Suez Canal was cleared and reopened. The Suez Crisis also revealed who the real superpowers were in the world: the United States and the Soviet Union, a power structure that would stay in place for another 3 decades. Before the war started, attacks conducted against Israel by Palestinian guerrilla groups based in Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan had increased, leading to costly Israeli reprisals. In November 1966, an Israeli strike on the village of Al Samu in the Jordanian West Bank left 18 dead and 54 wounded. And during an air battle with Syria in April 1967, the Israeli Air Force shot down 6 Syrian MiG fighter jets. In addition, Soviet intelligence reports in May indicated that Israel was planning a campaign against Syria. And although inaccurate, the information further heightened tensions between Israel and its Arab neighbors. The Egyptian president, Jamal Abdel Nasser, had previously come under sharp criticism for his failure to aid Syria and Jordan against Israel. He had also been accused of hiding behind the United Nations emergency force stationed at Egypt's border with Israel in the Sinai. Now, however, he moved to unambiguously demonstrate support for Syria. On May 14, 1967, Nasser mobilized Egyptian forces in the Sinai. On May 18th, he formally requested the removal of the UNIF station there, and on May 22nd, he closed the Gulf of Aqaba to Israeli shipping, thus instituting an effective blockade on the port city of Elaith in southern Israel. On May 30th, King Hussein of Jordan arrived in Cairo to sign a mutual defense pact with Egypt, placing Jordanian forces under Egyptian command. Shortly thereafter, Iraq too joined the alliance. Now, in response to the apparent mobilization of its Arab neighbors, early in the morning of June 5, Israel staged a sudden preemptive air assault that destroyed more than 90% of Egypt's air force on the tarmac. A similar air assault incapacitated the Syrian air force. Without cover from the air, the Egyptian army was left vulnerable to attack. Within 3 days, the Israelis had achieved an overwhelming victory on the ground, capturing the Gaza Strip and all of the Sinai Peninsula up to the east bank of the Suez Canal. The canal turned into a battleground between Israel and Egypt as the two nations renewed conflicts. At this point, Israeli forces continued to occupy one Egyptian peninsula. Israel refused to withdraw its forces from the peninsula despite urges from the United States to do so. Israel maintained control of Suez Canal's east bank. Egypt, attempting to regain control, formed a blockade and shut down the waterway by sinking ships on the ends of the canal. This conflict, or a stalemate, stayed like this for the next 6 years until Egypt and Israel signed a diplomatic ceasefire agreement and both the forces were withdrawn, with Israel returning the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt. The Suez Canal was under Egyptian control now, and it took Egypt 2 years to clean up the canal and get rid of the debris and mines from the 6 years of conflict. It was not until 5th June of 1975 that the canal reopened for trade. But because of cargo ships taking this route via the Cape of Good Hope for the 8 years that the canal was closed, prices of imported items skyrocketed, including that of oil. Other blockages on the canal after 1975 were negligibly short, and usually because of technical reasons. A ship stopped the flow of traffic through the canal in 2004, the Tropic Brilliance, an oil tanker, for 3 days. In 2006, another boat called Okal King Dor, a 93,000-ton cargo ship, drifted off at a wrong angle because of sandstorms and high winds, and was dislodged within 8 hours. Another ship in 2017, called the OOCL Japan, had its steering gear malfunctioned and was also pushed free in a few hours. And recently we all know about the ship called Ever Given, which blocked the canal for 6 days and delayed 12% of the world trade. The previously mentioned cases had very short duration, but still had effects all around the world in the form of price hikes and sudden market movements, which were expected and are to be expected on any future event of this resemblance. We have created a system like this, a system of money, control, economics, and energy. And when the system runs through a choke point, there will always be geostrategic value in the system and the choke point. Not just for economics, but for power. Take the example of the United States. Do you think they will sit back and let Egypt control the chokehold where 12% of the world economy passes through, including lots of oil? No. Despite the fact that Egypt is a non-democratic regime and is pretty terrible on all fronts, including human rights, the USA still provides $1.4 billion of military aid to Egypt every year. Egypt is always considered a key USA ally in the Middle East. They need Egypt to owe them favors mainly because Egypt has the Suez Canal. That can be seen today whenever a US military vessel shows up to the Suez Canal. They get to cut in line and go through it quicker than everybody else. Egypt has administrative control of the canal, but really it is the USA behind the scenes that is keeping everything in check. A node in this system, like the canal, can never be neutral. In wartime, not everybody will be able to take advantage of the canal. There will always be geopolitical importance placed on it. And as long as there is a superpower, that power will try to control the canal. This video was made possible by the support and donations of these magnificent souls, either through Patreon, Buy Me a Coffee, or through PayPal directly. If you also want to support my work, take a look at the links in the description. Thank you for watching.